He holds a Bachelor of Science, Environmental Science and a Master's degree in Sustainable Development. He's also a waste consultant, which sounds like he's a plumber, a waste consultant, sustainability analyst and entrepreneur pioneering construction waste tracking in Australia. To share with us the secrets of sustainability, please welcome William Buck's Senior Sustainability Analyst, Simon Lunn. Yes!
Thanks very much, everyone, and thanks for an amazing intro. Doesn't get any better than that. So, thanks. Hi, I'm Simon Lunn. I'm a sustainability analyst at William Buck, and for the last 10 years, I've been helping companies navigate the world of non-financial reporting. Today, I'm going to show you how you can use ESG and sustainability in your businesses to give you a competitive edge in the market. But what does that mean? Basically, how you can use sustainability to win more work. So I just want to start with why we're even talking about this. Basically, as a species, we're really good at growing. There's now 15 times as many people on the planet as there was just a couple of hundred years ago. This is having an effect on the Earth. We now occupy almost 50% of the Earth's land surface, and our carbon dioxide levels are going through the roof. So what we're talking about here is balancing our growth while also protecting our natural resources. And that's where the concept of sustainability comes in. But, as alluded to previously, sustainability is notoriously difficult to measure. It covers both environmental and social aspects. It's context-dependent, interconnected, multidisciplinary, and highly subjective in nature. So how does that relate to manufacturing? Well, basically, people like me are starting to demand more from companies and suppliers. But it's not just people like me. Companies are starting to ask more from themselves, and the government is also asking more questions. As a result, companies are having to prove that they're doing the right thing, and this is what we're talking about when we refer to sustainability reporting. But how do we measure it? And that's where the famous ESG comes into it. ESG stands for Environmental Social Governance, and it represents a group of indicators which are used to assess a company's sustainability performance. There is no limit to these indicators, but generally they fit into these type of categories. It's important to note that there's no one-size-fits-all with ESG or sustainability indicators, and companies should choose which ones are relevant to their operations. Having said that, one indicator that's very common across many businesses, that's very important, I should say, and material, is climate change and the emissions that that company is producing. This is measured through a process called carbon accounting, and that's what the rest of this presentation will focus on. So what is carbon accounting? Put simply, it's measuring the greenhouse gas that is associated with the operations of a company or an organisation. It's split into 3 different scopes. Scope 1 is direct emissions that are emitted from the activity itself, whether it's a vehicle or a generator on site. Scope 2 is an indirect emissions, which occurs at the electricity plant, which is required to power the electricity in your operations. And the third scope, and by far most overwhelming, is Scope 3 emissions. This covers basically everything else, from your employee commuting, your business travel, your waste, and importantly, your purchased goods and services. So where are we at with regulations on all this? Well, going back in time, governments have been getting together to try and bring about mandatory climate legislation. But by and large, these have been voluntary for most businesses. However, in the last few years, this is changing. The EU is moving first, of course, and they've started to mandate carbon emissions reporting for larger companies. And Australia is also looking to follow. So why am I, someone from an accounting company, talking about sustainability? Well, historically, they have been separate. The problem with this is there have been too many ESG frameworks and standards that different companies have chose to adhere to, that comparing one company's ESG performance with another is kind of like comparing apples and oranges. More recently, the International Financial Reporting Standards has looked to consolidate these frameworks and bring sustainability reporting in line with financial reporting. So they released last year the first sustainability disclosure standard, which includes a requirement for greenhouse gas emissions reporting. This has gained a lot of traction across the world. Many governments are looking to adopt this or similar set of guidelines in their own country, including Australia, with just the day after also releasing a consultation paper very closely aligned to the IFRS. This consultation paper has gone through a couple of rounds of revision and is in the government waiting to get passed into legislation, with an expected effectively coming into operation starting from 1st of January next year. So, what will be required as part of this? Larger companies will have to report on their sustainability, providing that report annually. There will also need to be a level of assurance around that sustainability report. So it's no longer just picking numbers and putting something together that looks good. But when is that going to happen, and who's it going to happen to? Well, the government is planning a staged rollout across 3 different groups. Larger companies will be first, but all companies over 50 million in revenue will be affected by this new legislation at some point. The planned rollout is next year, and the first reporting period will be the 25-26 financial year. That's when Group 1 is expected to have to report on their Scope 1 and 2 emissions. Going back to what we talked about earlier, Scope 1 and 2 emissions are actually the easiest to measure, and a lot of these companies are already doing that. So that shouldn't be too difficult. But where it gets interesting is with Scope 3 reporting. This will involve the larger companies having to contact their suppliers and ask them for information. So it won't just be a mandatory requirement for groups 1, 2, and 3. They're going to ask for data around the goods and services they receive from their supply chain. And this could be from any number of different companies. So here we are, William Buck, we wanted to get the ball rolling. So we went ahead and did our greenhouse gas inventory of our own operations to see how it's done. And I'd like to show you how we did that. First step in doing a greenhouse gas inventory or a carbon emissions assessment, those two are interchangeable, is to set the boundaries of what you want to look at. In the case of William Buck, we have different branches across Australia and some remote offices in the Philippines, so we defined our boundary as the New South Wales division. From there, you want to look at all the different types of emission sources going through the scopes. For us, being an office-based company, Scope 1 is quite small. It's basically just a small amount of gas that's in our fridges and air conditioning units, which, if released, can contribute to global warming. Obviously, most businesses use electricity, so that's identified in Scope 2. And Scope 3 is everything else, which is too much to list on this page. But some examples include your purchased goods and services, your employee commute, waste disposal, and a whole number of other things. So once you've identified where your emission sources are, the next challenge is gathering the data. If we start with electricity, it's actually quite a straightforward one. You can contact your electricity provider and ask them to summarise and send to you how much electricity your business used throughout that year's period. The same thing can be done with waste. If you have the right supplier, you can ask them for how much waste you used, and that is also a piece of data that you'll use in the carbon emissions inventory. Of course, it can get more complex. For example, with business travel, your employees may be travelling across Australia in planes, and you'll ideally get the kilometres they travelled and also what plane they were on. I'm seeing some blank stares. That's not always possible, of course. So where we have a catch-all is with your spend-based or the finances of your company. So let's say you can't get all that information from your employees about which flight they were on. At the moment, you can look at your overall spend that you spent, say, on Qantas, and you can attribute that, to calculate your carbon emissions. So how we use that data is basically we collect it, then we have our information, and we have to find an emissions factor. Emissions factor is a researched number that has been provided to by the government or another reliable source that gives you a direct conversion between the activity data that you have and how much carbon dioxide that relates to. I'll go through an example on the next one to hopefully make that a bit more clear. For example, if you use 1,000 kilowatt hours of electricity, you will then need an emissions factor to understand how much carbon dioxide was emitted. The emissions factors vary based on their location, and for example, in New South Wales, you would end up with just over a tonne of carbon dioxide emitted. But in Tasmania, they have a much better, so they have much more green energy in their grid, renewable energy resources. So the emissions factor in Tasmania is much lower. But these are quite complex, and selecting them is quite a challenge. So once you've done all that, then you can start reporting. It's here that you can see trends in your data and look at which categories in your business are emitting the most greenhouse gas. For example, with William Buck, food and drink is quite a high emitting activity. It may be a surprise to some of you, but food and drink has quite a long supply chain. So even just what you would think is just a small amount of food, it actually has quite a high greenhouse gas footprint. Secondly, business travel. And thirdly was electricity. But what's next? We know what we're doing, how much we're emitting, but what can we do about it? Well, basically, in our case, we looked at using green energy and improving our recycling systems. We're also currently going through the process of becoming carbon neutral certified, which requires offsetting the remaining emissions by purchasing a certified project, whether that's planting trees or abating carbon in some other way. So So what are the benefits of doing this? Well, as mentioned before, it's the right thing to do. The environment benefits, ideally society benefits, your people. But aside from that, you as a company should really look to improve its reputation by doing this. By improving your reputation, you can strengthen your relationships with your supply chain, ideally get more customers who are interested in that concept, and your employees might end up being more satisfied as well that they know their company is doing the right thing. There may be hidden benefits too, but you'll find that out along the way. For example, it might be that swapping to electric vehicles in your business would actually save you money. So there is some cost savings that can be achieved. And lastly, you're reducing the risk of not taking action and getting caught out later down the track and falling behind. It'll help you stay in business in some cases as well. Coles have put out a statement which has said they're going to require 75% of their suppliers to do some level of carbon emissions reporting by 2027. And if you go back to the phased rollout, that's not a coincidence. 2027 is when Coles is going to require to do Group 3, Scope 3 reporting. So now we're near the end. How can you prepare for this? Well, of course, start now. Engage in conversations with people, talk to your colleagues, get an understanding of what's going on and where you think you should make a move. But don't be afraid to do something. Just get started. Secondly, you probably want to start budgeting for this. If the trajectory continues as it has for the last few years, sustainability reporting will become much more important in the agenda and require money and time to put into it. Secondly, there's grants and funding you can look at, particularly for the manufacturing industry, to look at decarbonising activities. The New South Wales government is supporting that. And I know, as a scientist and someone who loves data, automation and technology will be key in streamlining this operation. Chasing down information in invoices is not sustainable. Getting your suppliers to provide that digitally or somehow automating the process is definitely going to save you time. And lastly, as we know, most emissions come from your supply chain, so it's very important to engage them, and getting them on board will be critical to reducing your overall greenhouse gas emissions. I'm Simon Lunn. I'm part of William Buck's carbon accounting team in Sydney. I'm looking forward to hearing your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you, Simon. Simon will be over at William Buck just over there, and you can ask him some questions. Or he's going to hang around here as well.